Ja, hvordan har vi oppfylt tarvene til sånn nøkter her? Hva slags så Nu citerar jag Høgni Reistrup Friedman. Du har en man som känner väl med Friedman personligen. Som är skånare som Rose. Och det är en människa som vi är glad för att finna ända in i Íslandi. En känd debattörer i Íslandi. Som eisne är nog så vänlig vid att sätta, kan man säga, så det har fått i debatterna här. Men kan ha haft nog så provokerande uttalelser. En människa som är så kontroversiell, talsmännen för fri- och marknadskraften. Vi har konstaterat att vi har pratat samman att han inte fäller helt in i skablonen och framsökta öllnöjtjön, men det damer väl att folk har en grej mening om tingene och kunde få ett gott årsigt igång. Och talar ner om Hólmsteinn Gissurarson som är professor vid Högskolan i Ísland och i samfelög, det är i politiska visen och som skriver en artikel av grejen och richer och boken om buskavarviset och fiskevinn och tjåskavarlög och som alltså är i samfelög. Tjeckare med annar har haft Friedman av i Íslandi i Eisen och har arrangerat Eisen ett återhalt av konferenser och fond om hälsosläm och större om samfällighetsviset. Hannes, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great honor to be invited here to the Faroe Islands. All the Icelanders appreciate very much that the Faroes were the first to reach us a helping hand in our great difficulties in the autumn of 2008. The Faroes then showed what we in Iceland call drengskapur, which is really a sense of honor and friendship and straightforwardness. So this is deeply ingrained in the Icelandic soul, what the Faroes did for us in our hour of dire need. And what I'm going to do here is to reflect a little bit on the struggle of small nations that sometimes have the suspicion that they are not sustainable as nations. And I'll just run through very quickly historical highlights of Iceland. Iceland was, as you may know, settled in 874 to 930. We established a commonwealth in 930, which lasted to 1262. And that has been a subject of great research by a lot of economists because we managed to have a order without government, which is quite an interesting combination. And then we became, as the Faroe Islands at roughly the same time, a country belonging to the Norwegian king and then to the Danish king. And we got home rule in 1904. And perhaps more interestingly, in 1918 we got sovereignty. And it's the reason the Danish really recognized the sovereignty of Iceland is that they had, because of the economic progress in Iceland from about 1870 to 1918, they saw that perhaps Iceland was sustainable. I don't think that their reluctance to give sovereignty to Iceland before was based on any ill will. They simply didn't think that we could stand on our own feet. But we succeeded in convincing them about this, so they granted sovereignty to us in 1918, and Iceland became a kingdom in a personal union with Denmark. So, interestingly, there was actually a kingdom of Iceland from 1918 to 1944, and they managed our foreign affairs and defense, but only we could actually, whenever we choose to, then we could take that into our own hands. We were, just like the Faroe Islands, occupied by the British on the 10th of May 1940, but unlike the Faroese, we were able to make a treaty with the United States to take over our defense in 1941. So we were not an occupied country for more than a year, which is quite important if you look at the recognition by other countries of Iceland. And we became a republic in 1944 and a member of NATO in 1949. And it's quite interesting what I discussed with Paul Mikkelsen and others yesterday. Should we have remained in a personal union with Denmark, just like Canada and Australia and New Zealand do with the United Kingdom? It would have saved us actually to have to elect from our own ranks somebody who would be the head of state and who might develop some royal pretensions, just to have somebody far away that would take care of all those formal duties that the head of state does. Quite an interesting thought, but it is said and done, and we became a republic. And the main facts about Iceland, of course, the Faroese are more familiar with them than most others, that we are 325,000, that we have roughly the same size as East Germany was, and that we have a relatively good GDP per capita. It was 21,000 in 1990. It increased over the next years. In 2008, it was 39,000 in current prices, and now it is the same as it was in 2008, 39,000 as well. And the main exporters are fish and aluminium and financial services. But we have been reconsidering our history, and I have devoted a lot of thought to it. I think that actually from 874 to 1874, Iceland was a desperately poor country. We could only sustain about 50,000 people. Iceland was caught in the Malthusian trap. If there were more people, they died. And the low mark of the population was in two years. In 1709, after a great epidemic, the Icelanders went down to 38,000 people. And in 1787, after the volcanic eruptions in the south of Iceland, they also went down to 39,000. That is the low of the Icelandic population. Quite interesting for anyone who is discussing the sustainability of a nation. And nature took care of it. If there was an increase in the population, people simply died in famines in Iceland. Until in the late 19th century, they ceased to just die of hunger. Those who were very poor or destitute, they moved to the United States, and about 20 to 30% of the population of Iceland moved to Canada and to the US in the late 19th and early 20th century. So we have now a minority of 100,000 people in especially Canada, but also in the north of the United States. It's quite interesting to visit them and see how they maintained a little bit of an Icelandic identity. I think also that our poverty was wrongly blamed on the Danish. The Danish never understood this little strange colony that they had in the north by the vexations of history. They were not trying to do any ill. What basically made us poor, that we didn't utilize our resources in any reasonable way. Because what happened in Iceland that made Iceland poor was that the agriculture held down the fisheries. Iceland really then only had one good natural resource, which is the fertile fishing grounds around Iceland, and people were not allowed to build cities or to specialize in fishing. Everybody had to be resident on a farm, registered on a farm. So the farming community, the large farmers, they basically stopped all wealth creation in Iceland. They hindered the development of resources. So if we wanted to know who was to blame for the poverty of the Icelanders, we shouldn't look to the Danish, we should just look into a mirror. And here you can see actually the development of the Icelandic population over the centuries since the first census was taken in 1703. And you can see that for the first 100 years, 150 to 200 years, we were in a Malthusian trap. We were only 50,000, but then the population started to climb and is now, as I said, 325,000 people. It's sort of a normal increase that we have had. So we escaped this Malthusian trap. But what is very interesting when we discuss Iceland, and I think it is also interesting to the Faroese, is that Denmark granted us sovereignty in 1918. And there was a treaty between Iceland and Denmark. And that treaty enabled the Danes to come to Iceland and work, and for the Icelanders to go to Denmark and work. And there were actually 2 members of parliament that voted against the treaty because they said that Iceland would be full of Danes and they would take over everything in Iceland and utilize our natural resources. But you can see by the graph I'm going to show to you how absurd in a sense this is. Because if we compare the living standards of the Icelanders and the Danes in the late 19th and early 20th century, we'll see a very interesting picture, the GDP per capita in the same dollars from 1870 to 1940. And here is Iceland, how the living standards in Iceland developed during this period. And then you have the living standards in Denmark. And you can see that at the time when the treaty was made in 1918, the living standards in Denmark were double what they were in Iceland. So there was no danger of the Danes flocking to Iceland, since they had double the living standard. However, this all changed in the war, because the living standards in Denmark went abruptly down with the occupation, but ours went up because we found, as I think the Faroes did as well, a good market for our fish in England. And then the Americans came with all their money. So Iceland caught up with Denmark in the early 1940s, essentially. But in retrospect, I see now that I didn't realize as a younger man that the prosperity that we gained, making us equal to the Danes from 1940 on, was in some ways false. Because we had war profits. We had a lot of profit in the hot war, and then the Americans had a base in Iceland and made a substantial contribution to the Icelandic economy after the war. And then what we did was to widen out our resource bases by 4 extensions of our economic zone, so that we drove out all the foreigners. They had actually caught half the fish that was caught in the Icelandic waters, but we drove them out, so we were extending our resource bases, and that's something that only gives you temporary increase in your wealth. And then we also overfished. First the herring that disappeared from the Icelandic waters in the late 1960s, and then the cod. Even if that didn't disappear, but there was a danger of that in the late 1970s. So I think that the war profits, the extended resource base, and the overfishing, they were not creating wealth. We were just doing more of the same thing. However, of course, there was also spontaneous economic growth in Iceland in this period. But there were signs of an economic decline in the late 1980s. And here I have to declare an interest, because I was very much a part of the people that in the late 1980s told the Icelandic population, we have to change course. We have to create a sustainable economy. An economy that's creating wealth, that doesn't only depend on the Americans or extending our fisheries limit or in increasing the catch of herring or cod, that is sustainable. So there was I think everybody would agree now, although people have divided opinions about it, that there was a different path taken in 1991. When Davíð Oddsson formed his first government. He formed it on the 30th of April in 1991, and I still remember that day, because in the evening I celebrated with Davíð and 2 other advisors of him. You can see this young man to far right, that's me, quite different from what I'm now, and Davíð Oddsson is in the center. And what we tried to do in the next 13 or 14 years was to make the Icelandic economy a Western open economy. Just like most of the economies around us were. What we did was to cut subsidies. Davíð Oddsson basically emptied his waiting room, because he ceased to give out government grants and favors. Before he took power, there was a lot of funds, regional funds, and industrial development funds. And the waiting room of the Prime Minister was full of people who were trying to get grants from those funds. But one thing that, for example, Milton Friedman told me was the ability to get grants is not necessarily the same as the ability to operate enterprises. The ability to make very good PowerPoint shows to the management of funds is not perhaps the same as the ability to work hard, be enterprising and open to new ideas and so on. So we emptied the waiting room of the Prime Minister. And we stabilized the economy, the inflation went down and the government deficit disappeared. And the markets were liberalized. We became a member of the European Economic Area, gaining access to all the European market. We privatized a lot of companies, and we cut taxes, very importantly. And we developed private property rights to natural resources. I wrote a book about it, which for those of you who are interested in it, is downloadable on the internet from the Institute of Economic Affairs in London, called Overfishing, the Icelandic Solution. And we strengthened our pension funds, so they have for the last 10 or 20 years been the second strongest one in terms of proportional GDP in the world after the Dutch ones. And the main tax cuts were that we cut the corporate income tax from 45% to 18%. I saw in Børsen, when I was just reading Børsen this morning, that the British are cutting the corporate income tax, and the Danes are saying, we are really getting behind. You know, corporations are going to move from Denmark to the UK, and that's precisely what they're doing. The British, they are engaging in tax competition with the Danes, the Swedes, the Norwegians and others by cutting corporate income tax. So we cut it quite extensively, 45% to 18%. We cut the government share of the income tax extensively. We abolished the turnover tax. We abolished a special surcharge on office and trade buildings and on high incomes. Both of this was, of course, because these are unpopular groups. Merchants who occupy such buildings, they are unpopular, and so are people with high income. But it really distorts the economy to have special taxes on those things. You shouldn't really tax people simply because they are unpopular. And we abolished the net wealth tax, and we reduced the death duties or the estates tax. But what was very interesting was the experience from this. And I will note that I'm going to show you only the experience before the credit boom, before all the credit expansion that eventually was the nemesis of the Icelandic economy. What I'm going to do is to show you how the revenue from the corporate income tax changed with the reduction in the corporate income tax. And here you can see how the corporate income tax was reduced from 45%, well, 50% actually the year before, but 45% to 18%. Here you can see that that is the blue line. And what happened then to the revenue as a proportion of GDP, which is the most interesting comparison. What happened was that actually the revenue for the government went up because a smaller pie of a larger cake can be greater than a greater section of a smaller pie. The tax basis with the increase in wealth and so on made for better revenues. It was really quite a clear demonstration of the Laffer curve. And you can see that I end the tail here in 2003, before the banks started to expand their credit and so on, before the boom. So it's very important for us to realize that this was not the effect of the artificially created boom after 2004, and I'm going to go better into that in this lecture. And then we developed, and that may be somewhat controversial in the Faroese Islands, we developed the system of individual transferable quotas in our fisheries. We had open access, and if you have open access, you will basically destroy your profit by overfishing. We discovered actually that the effort quotas of fishing days were not very efficient in regulating it because they didn't maximize profit. They may have maximized output, maximized boats, maximized activity in the fisheries, but it didn't maximize the difference between revenue and cost, because there was no incentive really to minimize cost in the fishing days system. And in 1975 we introduced individual quotas in the herring fishery, and they then became transferable. And in 1984, we introduced individual quotas in the demersal fisheries, and they gradually became transferable as well. And the system became a comprehensive system in 1990. And the Icelandic fisheries are quite profitable. They are both sustainable and profitable. And they have really been the basis of our recovery, as we'll see later. Well, Oddsson, with his advisors, he was in government as Prime Minister to the 15th of September 2004. And I'm not entirely sure that he's very happy on this photograph. We had a dinner then that evening. There were several reasons for that. One was that he has, successfully though, because it's a good end to a sad story, he had fought cancer, and he successfully fought about the cancer. And he was in hospital just 2 months before he stepped down as Prime Minister. There was a turnaround, another turnaround, I believe, in retrospect, in 2004. Because what happened was that our kind of market capitalism, with competition, an independent judiciary, free media, and the economic power separate from political power, that was replaced by crony capitalism, because there was a huge fight in Iceland, a political fight in 2004 between Oddsson and an oligarch, Jón Ásgeir Jóhannesson, and the oligarch really won that fight. So I believe that you can characterize the years from 2004 to 2008 as being crony capitalism rather than market capitalism. Jóhannesson, he owned most of the media, almost all the private media. He was supported by politicians, and he supported them financially. The judiciary was quite cooperative, and we had in Iceland a Klondike mentality. He and his cronies, they were looked upon as Croesus, who would make everything into gold that he touched. And everybody wanted to have a share of the fun of the game, so to speak. So there was almost no criticism of the wild expansion of the Icelandic companies and banks at that time. So the whole thing collapsed in 2008, although there were actually 7 or 8 economies in Europe which had the worst time. And then some critics say that the Icelandic banking sector was big, but I think so were the sectors in Switzerland and the United Kingdom. I have rejected some of the common explanations for the Icelandic crash, like those. And then people say that the Icelandic bankers were reckless. Oh yes, they were reckless. But so were bankers elsewhere, like those who managed the Royal Bank of Scotland and the UBS in Switzerland that had to be bailed out not once but twice, because many people don't realize that the UBS, this grand bank in Switzerland, had to be bailed out before the financial crisis by the Sovereign Fund of Singapore. And then it was bailed out by the Swiss government in 2008. Some bankers. Well, and then people say we had these crazy neoliberals in Iceland and they liberalized too much, deregulated. But in the financial markets we had precisely the same regulation as in other EE countries. Because that's basically what it was all about, the membership. It was about harmonization of the rules. So we had precisely the same legal and statutory framework as all the other member states of the European Economic Area. I believe that the explanation for the crash, for the bank collapse in Iceland in late 2008, lies in a combination of a vulnerable situation and crucial decisions that came from abroad, rather than in a neoliberal experiment that failed, or in terribly reckless bankers, or in an oversized banking sector. Why was it that the Icelandic banks were able to expand so quickly and so much in the years 2004 to 2008? It was because no good deed goes unpunished. What happened was that the very good administration, the fiscal and monetary stability created from 1991 to 2004, of course, resulted in very high ratings, credit ratings, both for the Republic of Iceland and for the banks. So the banks in Iceland had almost unlimited access to money because of the good ratings that had been created by the Öström governments, and they were used to do what? You will be astonished by the graph I'm going to show you now. It's about the development of external debt. Look at it. You know, from 2004 to 2008, it just exploded. And it exploded because Icelandic bankers enjoyed the high ratings, which were the result of the Öström governments, but also because there was no criticism and there was nothing to hold them, because crony capitalism had replaced market capitalism, and there was no criticism, there was nothing to contain them, the bankers and the businessmen who controlled the banks. Now, there was a special investigation in Iceland, and a report, very long report, was delivered in 2010. And there the Special Investigation Commission said that essentially 3 business groups controlled the Icelandic economy. And then they criticized these business groups for their behavior. And it's very interesting to compare these 3 business groups. To compare the credit extended to those 3 business groups, and I'm using the same classification as the Special Investigation Commission did. First we can see the loans to Jóhannesson and his cronies. Then we can see the second business group, and then we can see the third business group. And those are, as I said, classifications by the Special Investigation Commission. And it's quite clear from this graph that it was a bubble of Jóhannesson and his cronies, the people who controlled all the media, who had all this impact on the judiciary and on political commentators and so on. It was his bubble. And of course, he had several uses for his money. This nice flat in Manhattan, and of course a private jet, and of course a private yacht. And to be fair, a lot of investments that were quite good. But this of course created a strange feeling in Iceland when people were doing this jet setting. It was a different kind of society. It created a lot of envy and resentment, and feelings that were first suppressed but then exposed against capitalism. So I believe that if you look at Iceland in 2008, there were several risks for the economy. One was specific to Iceland, that it was too much cross-ownership and overvalued assets, the crony capitalism that I spoke about. Another risk which was specific to Iceland and wasn't shared by many other countries was that under the EEA treaty, the field of operations of the Icelandic banks was the whole of Europe, the field of operations. But it turned out that the field of institutional support was Iceland alone. But that's something that didn't occur to anyone at the time, that these would be 2 totally divergent fields, the field of operations and the field of institutional support and guarantees by government. And then of course we had the general risk under which all financial markets suffered, which is the moral hazard of banking, that if everything goes well, then you put the profit into your pocket. But if it doesn't go well, then the taxpayer is supposed to feed the bill. But that creates moral hazard, and everybody knows about that. And then there were government mistakes like the low interest rate in the US from 2001. And the third thing that may have caused the international crisis was the difficulty of pricing risk with the new financial techniques that were developed in the early 21st century. And we still haven't found ways to price risk correctly. We thought we did, but I think basically there is a very deep philosophical point there that I'm not going to go into too much. It is that there is an essential difference between risk and uncertainty. And the risk may perhaps be priced, but you can never price uncertainty. It lies in the nature of uncertainty, and perhaps capitalism is always subject to some kind of uncertainty. That's just something that we have to live with, I think. But this is the vulnerable situation that I described, and then into this vulnerable situation in Iceland came 3 crucial decisions from abroad. And they've not been realized by everybody. For example, the first one, and that I think sounded the death knell of the Icelandic banking sector. It was that the American Federal Reserve System refused to make the same dollar swap lines to Iceland as they did with, for example, Denmark, Sweden and Norway. Now, I sat on the board of the Central Bank of Iceland from 2001 and 2009 and followed this closely from there. You see, there is no problem with liquidity of banks if all their obligations are in the domestic currency. If I am the governor of the Central Bank and you are a banker and you have a problem with liquidity, I can just print kroner for you. No problem. But if your obligations are in dollars, what am I to do as the governor of the Central Bank? I can't print dollars. But with the dollar swap lines, the central banks of Denmark, Sweden and Norway and many others like Switzerland, they essentially got a license to print dollars to relieve their banks, the commercial banks of liquidity problems in dollars or pounds. This meant that we were not able to bail out the banks if we wanted to. And then the British Labour government refused to extend assistance to the Icelandic-owned banks in London, at the same time as it rescued Lloyds Bank and the Royal Bank of Scotland and other banks in England. And then the third thing that really destroyed the remnants of the Icelandic banking sector was that the British Labour government invoked an anti-terrorism law on one of the Icelandic banks. And nobody made any distinction between the Icelandic banks. So by implication, all Icelandic companies were more or less treated as terrorist organizations, and all transfers to and from Iceland, they were cut off. We couldn't even get medicine or food from abroad for a while. I mean, this was a real crisis. It was like in a war. Iceland was under siege. It was a very strange feeling for somebody who was used to the daily comforts of an advanced civilization to realize suddenly that we were alone in the world and we couldn't pay for necessities and so on because we were cut off. And that was because of this. Then slowly we were able to re-establish lines of credit and trade with other countries. But this really made it totally impossible for us to rescue any part of the Icelandic system. Now we have recovered, that's quite true, and slowly we've recovered. I think that we have recovered because of decisions that were taken in the beginning of the crisis. And those two decisions were first to allow the krona to plunge. It really plunged a lot. And that enabled the export industries to produce Iceland out of the crisis. And then what we did was to ring-fence the economy. What we essentially did was to rescue the domestic part of the banking sector and put the foreign part into a resolution process. So those two decisions were taken immediately in the crisis, and they enabled the recovery of Iceland. But unfortunately, there was really a moral crisis as well in Iceland, and capitalism was totally discredited. People realized that the dance had come to an end, the band had stopped to sing, and they thought that this was the result of the market reforms of 1991 and 2004. I didn't realize that this was the crony capitalism of 2004 to 2008 that had gone just out of all bounds. And the petty, vengeful, hard-left government came to power in February 2009. And what was interesting in the next 1 or 2 years was that the International Monetary Fund became a hand collector for the British and the Dutch governments who wanted the Icelandic taxpayers to pick up the bill because they decided unilaterally to bail out the depositors in the accounts in the Icelandic banks in England and the Netherlands. And there was a dispute between Iceland and the UK and the Netherlands, the ISAFE dispute, which was about this issue. And the EFTA court decided finally that the Icelandic taxpayers had no obligation to reimburse the British and the Dutch governments for them having bailed out the depositors in those banks. That it was, as I always thought it was just a trade, just a business between depositors and banks, and those were things that they did at their own risk, those people, the depositors. And I think that in Iceland there are rough waters ahead because we have by no means solved all our problems. We still owe a lot to foreign bank creditors. The hard-left government didn't really cut expenditure. It only postponed all kinds of necessary investments in infrastructure. It scared away investors and tried to destroy the Icelandic system in the fisheries, the ITQ system. And the Wall Street Journal really wrote that this was suicidal. I do agree with them on that. And it was voted down in 2013, and it is the greatest debacle in Icelandic political history, because the government lost 27%, 28% of its vote. For example, the Social Democrats, they went down from 29% to 14%. You know, they were harmed. They really were almost destroyed by this. They had such a bad record. And there is a new center-right government, which is battle-scarred and very cautious, and doesn't really want to implement any radical reforms of the form that were implemented in 1991 to 2004. So I come to the lessons from this, and I think there is both a general lesson and a lesson for small nations, and I will discuss both of them. The general lesson is that there should be less uniformity in financial markets, and that's something that is not pointed out very often. Extensive regulation did not hinder the crisis, so should we have more of the things that did not work? If you actually regulate the financial sector very strictly, it creates a false sense of security. You think that since things are so strictly regulated, you do not have to look into the companies yourself that you entrust with your money, for example. And more importantly, if you have a very strict regulation, then all of these companies, financial companies, will have the same internal structure of risk-taking and so on. They will all be of the same kind, and that by itself will increase risk if they are all alike in their internal composition of risk and capital. So there is an additional systemic risk from harmonizing rules. What you really have to do more, rather, is more correct pricing of risk if you can. And that you can with competition and diversity in markets, with smaller units, and with the responsibility for the transactions taken by the depositors and by the financial companies. So if they make a lot of mistakes, they fail. If they make a lot of good decisions, they profit and prosper. That's basically the only thing we can do, in my opinion. So out of the depression, out of the financial crisis, I see only one way, perhaps not surprisingly, but it is tax cuts and economic growth. It is a policy of trying to stimulate economic growth, not by spending too much government money, but by creating opportunities for companies to grow and for the economy to adjust to situations, becoming flexible and free and open. But that leaves us with the other question: what about us, the small nations, the Faroe Islands and Iceland? This is the general picture. What about us? Well, in the past there was a famous discussion between the Athenians and the Melians, which Thucydides tells us about in his history of the Peloponnese Wars. And Athens was much bigger than Melos, and they demanded in 417 that the Melians surrendered and paid tribute, or they would be destroyed. And the Athenians said to the Melians, "You know as well as we do that right, as the world goes, is only in question between equals in power, while the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must." And I'm afraid that this is the law in international in the international arena. We see that very well now in the Ukraine and the Crimean, and basically this applies most of the time. We got two kinds of false security. One was during the Cold War, when everything was bound. Nobody moved because of the danger of a nuclear war. But then after the collapse of the Soviet Union, we also had a false security because there was only one superpower in the world, the United States, that protected the rest of us. So we didn't realize that the Athenians may have been right when they said that The strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. The Melians refused actually and they were destroyed, but the irony of history is that Athens lost the war and Melos was actually restored. So my lesson for Iceland, having lived through this very strange time when the only friends that we had were the Faroese and the Polish, which they also offered us loans. And when our traditional allies, the US and the UK, they just abandoned us or did even worse by invoking terrorist laws against us, is that we need allies. We were left out in the cold, Iceland was in 2008. And we need a shelter, but our shelter mustn't be a trap that will entrap us and make us into a dependency of somebody else whose biggest ambition in life is to receive welfare checks. And I think, unfortunately, the European Union is more a trap than a shelter for small nations. I'm nothing against the European Union. I think the European Union should be applauded for being a peace treaty between Germany and France. Finally, the civil war in the continent stopped with the European Union. But essentially, the European Union is a continental project, and we are no part of it, in my opinion. We should, of course, gain access to the European market. We should be friends with the European Union, but the European Union doesn't fit us. I'm not going to speak for anyone else, but it doesn't fit us. Whereas I would certainly be a supporter of membership of the European Union if I was an Estonian, for precisely the reasons we see on the TV screen when the Russian army is getting into Crimea. So despite being let down by our traditional allies, I think we should really try to nurture relationships with them. With the United States, that was a good ally of ours while it lasted from 1941 to 2006. Then they just abandoned us because we were not strategically important anymore. But we should really try to cultivate ties with them and with the United Kingdom and with Canada, despite everything. So I believe that the foreign policy of Iceland should be really to try to seek allies. And of course, we should maintain good ties with friendly neighbors, like the Faroe Islands and with Greenland and with Norway and with the whole of the North Atlantic. That's where we belong. And we can do nothing about it. And that's precisely where I'm really going to close with the final reflections on smallness. We in Iceland, and I suppose you think the same in the Faroe Islands, we cannot help our smallness. We are created that way. We are born into those societies. We have no choice about it. It's our fate that we are small and we are a little bit helpless in the world. But smallness is a challenge. It's not only a problem, it's also an opportunity. Because there are a lot of things that are better in small societies than in bigger societies. And in fact, Gary Becker tells me that in a comparison he made between smaller nations and bigger nations, the smaller nations tended to be more prosperous because they maintained open economies, whereas the bigger ones can afford to protect their domestic industries. That we can't do in the smaller nations. And there are all kinds of other things that I needn't tell the Faroese about small nations that are very, very nice. We have low information costs, good cohesion, open economy. And I think that what Høgni was telling us in the talk here before is precisely the problem we face. It is the challenge of maintaining a strong and vibrant economy which creates jobs. Otherwise people will leave. And we do not want the other choice or the other alternative, which is to be a kind of a museum of quaint folks that people come to visit in the summertime and they dance their folk dances and they receive welfare checks. That's not really a very attractive prospect for us. We want to stand on our own feet. We want to create our own wealth. We do want to do so in friendship and with trade with Denmark and with Germany and with the European Union and with the US, but we want to be independent. And I believe that capitalism is actually our only hope. Thank you.